leaving plot 1 alone. Now I want to go to plot 2 and change the ordered pair. Instead of L1, L3, I want to look at L1, L2. Now to begin with, I'm going to turn scatter plot 1 back off. So I'm just looking at the curve. Oops, I didn't get it right. That's not right. Okay, if you actually follow the directions, you're going to change that to L1, L2. There we go. Okay, so the points in this scatter plot are L1, which is the angle, and L2, which is the cosine value of that angle. So each of the points on this curve is in the form angle, comma, cosine value. Okay, now if we think about our unit circle graph, let me get it turned back on. There we go. Now the points on the circle are cosine, sine. So where are your cosines? Cosine is the x-coordinate of the point on the circle, and it's the y-coordinate of the point on the curve. So if we press trace and then use the right arrow key to get to some point on our circle, just a couple of clicks, okay, this value, 0.9238793, is the cosine value of that angle. When I toggle down to look at this point on the second curve, this number should be the y-coordinate of the point on the curve. And it is. Okay, now let's get to some point maybe in the second quadrant. Okay, here is the cosine of our point, negative 0.707. If I toggle over to the other curve, the cosine curve, the y-coordinate on that cosine curve is negative 7.07. That corresponds to an angle of 2.56 radians. Okay, so what I'm hoping that you're catching up, kind of cluing into here, is that the x-coordinate of the point on the unit circle matches the y-coordinate of the point on the cosine curve. It's not as easy to see as when we were looking at sine and the y-coordinates for both scatter plots matched. Now we're going to go through and take a look at points in the first quadrant, second quadrant, third quadrant, and fourth quadrant, just like we did with our sine curve. So let me trace to a point on my circle that is in the first quadrant. Okay, actually let me take a look at the very beginning point. Here we have a cosine value. This is the point that corresponds to 0 radians. Notice that the cosine value is starting at 1. And then if I travel around my curve and stop at the point where the angle corresponds to pi over 2 radians, notice that we're going to call this 0. That's tiny enough to be 0. The cosine value is 0. So the x-coordinates of the point in the first quadrant start at 1 and go to 0, which is what the y-coordinates should be doing on our cosine curve. So let me back up and get to the point where the angle is 0. Okay, 0 radians. Here's the cosine value. If I toggle over to the cosine curve, now I've got the angle 0 radians. Cosine value is 1. Alright, and you'll see that those y-coordinates are decreasing, and we get closer to a y value of, we'll call that 0, when x is pi over 2. So for angles in the first quadrant, angles whose terminal sides end up in the first quadrant, we've got x coordinates that start at 1 and decrease to 0. So on our cosine curve, we have y values that start at 1 up here and decrease to 0. We have an x-intercept at pi over 2. Do a similar investigation for points in the second quadrant. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, so our points in the second quadrant, on the circle, think about the x-coordinates. They start at an x value of 0 and decrease to an x value of -1. So on the interval from pi over 2 to pi radians, our cosine curve should start at 0 and decrease to -1. Take a look at the third quadrant. Points in the third quadrant right here. The x values start at an x-coordinate of -1 and go to an x-coordinate of 0 right here. So that's actually, think about the points are moving further to the right. So that's an increase in x values from -1 to 0 for angles from pi over 2, from angles from pi to 3 pi over 2. So on the interval from pi to 3 pi over 2, our cosine curve should be increasing from a cosine value of -1 to a cosine value of 0. Take a look at the fourth quadrant. Points in the fourth quadrant are here. So think about what happens with those x values. We've got an x value of 0 that corresponds to the angle that's 3 pi over 2, and we've got a cosine value of 1 that corresponds to the angle that's 2 pi. So from 3 pi over 2, that's not a good place to write that. From 3 pi over 2, which that's not even the right place. I'll get it right in a minute here. 3 pi over 2 is this point on the x-axis right there to 2 pi. Okay, our x values are going from 0 to 1, so the cosine curve is going from an x-intercept to a maximum point at 1.